school bully lays hands on the wrong black girls. Some battles aren't won with fists, but with brains, courage, and the power of community. The hallways of Roosevelt High School were always chaotic between classes, but today felt different. Jasmine Williams moved through the crowd with purpose, her natural hair styled in two perfect puffs, backpack slung over one shoulder. As captain of the debate team and as straight a student, she kept to herself and focused on her goals. College applications were due in 3 months, and nothing was going to distract her from her dream of attending Howard University. Marcus Jenkins ruled the hallways of Roosevelt High, standing at 6'2" with broad shoulders from football training. He used his size to intimidate younger students. His favorite targets were the quiet ones, the smart ones, the ones least likely to fight back. For 3 years, Jasmine had managed to stay off his radar, but that was about to change. Jasmine was organizing her locker when she heard a commotion down the hall. Marcus had cornered Elijah, a freshman who'd transferred to Roosevelt just 2 weeks ago. Marcus was demanding Elijah's lunch money, while his 2 friends blocked any escape routes. "Please, I don't have anything," Elijah pleaded, his voice cracking. "Check his pockets," Marcus commanded one of his friends, laughing as the smaller boy tried to back away. Jasmine felt something stir inside her. Maybe it was the memory of her little brother facing similar treatment at his school last year. Maybe it was the accumulated frustration of watching this happen week after week. Whatever it was, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Jasmine closed her locker with a decisive click and walked directly toward the scene. Students parted to let her through, murmuring in surprise. Nobody stood up to Marcus. Nobody. "Leave him alone," Jasmine said, her voice clear and steady. The hallway fell silent. Even Marcus seemed shocked by the interruption. "Mind your own business," Marcus sneered, regaining his composure. "Unless you want to be next." Jasmine placed herself between Marcus and Elijah. "I'm making this my business. He said he doesn't have anything, so back off." Marcus's friends exchanged glances, unsure how to handle this unexpected challenge to their authority. Marcus himself seemed momentarily thrown, but anger quickly replaced his surprise. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, stepping closer until he towered over her. Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm someone who's tired of watching you terrorize people half your size." Marcus's face flushed red. He put his hand on Jasmine's shoulder and shoved her backward. "Get out of my way." The crowd gasped. Marcus had crossed a line. He had put his hands on her. For a brief moment, fear flickered across Jasmine's face, then dissolved into something else entirely: determination. The hallway fell into a strange, suspended silence the moment Marcus's hand made contact with Jasmine's shoulder. Time seemed to slow down as her body rocked slightly backward from the force of his shove. Students who had been hurrying to class now stood frozen, books clutched to their chests, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Some turned away, unable to watch what they believed would be Jasmine's humiliation. Others pulled closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of confrontation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the gathered crowd. Jasmine felt the pressure of Marcus's hand against her shoulder, the physicality of his intimidation tactic registering in her mind as something different than mere words or threats. This was crossing a boundary, one that he had likely crossed with others before her. She thought of Elijah, trembling behind her, and all the other students who had suffered silently under Marcus's reign of hallway terror. The weight of Marcus's hand seemed to carry all of that history with it. For a fraction of a second, instinctual fear flickered across her face, the natural response of a body recognizing potential danger. Her heart rate accelerated, pumping adrenaline through her system, preparing her for the traditional options in threatening situations, fight or flight. But Jasmine had prepared for this moment. Over weeks of observing Marcus's patterns, she had anticipated that eventually, when challenged, he would escalate to physical intimidation. It was his playbook, his way of maintaining control when his verbal threats didn't achieve the desired effect. That brief flicker of fear transformed into something entirely different, a cool, focused determination that settled over her features like a mask. Her eyes, which had momentarily widened, now narrowed with purpose. Her breathing, which had momentarily quickened, steadied into a controlled rhythm. The corners of her mouth, which had briefly turned downward, now set into a firm, resolute line. With deliberately slow movements that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy surrounding them, Jasmine reached into the pocket of her jacket. There was no fumbling, no desperate grasping. Her fingers found what they were looking for with practiced precision. When her hand emerged, it held her smartphone, its screen already illuminated, the camera app open and recording. She had started the recording before approaching Marcus, another element of her careful planning. The device captured everything. The confrontation, Marcus's aggressive posturing, and most crucially, the moment his hand made contact with her shoulder, indisputable evidence of physical intimidation. "I've been documenting every incident for the past 3 weeks," Jasmine announced, her voice projecting clearly down the corridor, reaching even those students at the edges of the gathering crowd. There was no tremor in her words, no hint of the nervousness that might be expected from someone confronting the school's most feared bully. Instead, her tone carried the measured confidence of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes game. "Every student you've intimidated, every dollar you've taken, every threat you've made. I have dates, times, and witnesses." The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the hallway. Several students audibly gasped. Others exchanged glances of amazement mixed with a dawning hope. Marcus's friends, who had been flanking him with cocky smirks, now shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they too might be implicated in whatever evidence Jasmine had compiled. Their body language changed subtly, weight shifting from foot to foot, eyes darting toward exits, creating physical distance between themselves and Marcus, as if to disassociate from what was unfolding. Marcus himself stood motionless, his hand still suspended in the air where it had been after shoving Jasmine. The confident sneer that had seemed permanently etched onto his face faltered, replaced by an expression rarely seen on the bully's features: uncertainty. His mind raced to assess this unexpected threat, to calculate how much Jasmine might actually know, how much evidence she might actually have. It was a situation his usual tactics couldn't resolve. No amount of physical intimidation could erase digital evidence once captured. The power dynamics were shifting beneath his feet like sand, and he struggled to find solid footing. "You're bluffing," Marcus finally managed, but even as the words left his mouth, they lacked conviction. The subtle crack in his voice betrayed the first tendrils of doubt creeping into his mind. His eyes darted to the phone in Jasmine's hand, then to the faces around them, searching for any sign that this was an elaborate prank, a desperate gambit rather than a genuine threat to the immunity he had enjoyed for so long. "Try me," Jasmine replied, the two simple words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. With deliberate slowness, she turned the phone screen toward Marcus, allowing him to see what had been captured. The video played back the last 30 seconds in high definition, his aggressive stance, his threatening words, and most damning of all, his hand shoving against Jasmine's shoulder. "This is assault, Marcus. That's not just a school violation. It's a crime. And now I have it on video." The color drained from Marcus's face as the reality of his situation became impossible to deny. The evidence was right there, undeniable and incriminating. In the space of 10 seconds, what had begun as another routine intimidation had transformed into potential legal trouble. The facade of invincibility that he had carefully constructed over years began to crumble visibly, pieces of his confident persona falling away to reveal something much more vulnerable underneath, a teenager suddenly facing consequences that had always seemed comfortably distant. The surrounding crowd had grown larger now, the confrontation drawing students like moths to a flame. What made this spectacle particularly powerful was the shifting energy in the hallway. Where once there would have been fearful silence, now there was a palpable sense of possibility, of long-established power structures being challenged. Many students had their own phones out, creating a digital perimeter around the confrontation, each device capturing this moment of reckoning from different angles. What had started as one person's stand was transforming into a collective documentation of truth. "You can't do anything with that," Marcus said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He took a step backward, physically retreating for perhaps the first time in the school's corridors. His imposing frame, which had minutes ago seemed to dominate the space through sheer presence, now appeared diminished, as if the revelation had physically shrunk him. His friends had retreated further, creating even more distance between themselves and what was increasingly looking like a sinking ship. Jasmine watched the transformation with clear eyes, neither gloating nor backing down. This moment wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about accountability, about systematic change rather than personal vindication. "I already have," she informed him, each word measured and precise. "I sent everything to Principal Davis this morning. I sent copies to the school board and the superintendent." She paused, allowing the scope of her preparation to sink in before delivering the final piece. "And I've been working with 5 other students who've been keeping similar records." The strategic brilliance of Jasmine's approach became fully apparent in that moment. She hadn't acted alone or impulsively. She hadn't responded to intimidation with counter-intimidation. Instead, she had built a coalition, gathered evidence meticulously, and created a case that couldn't be dismissed as one person's word against another's. She had transformed individual vulnerability into collective strength, personal grievance into institutional accountability. In doing so, she had discovered a power that Marcus, for all his physical strength and cultivated fear, had never accessed: the power of organized, documented truth. Marcus stood in the center of a circle that was closing in on him, not physically but metaphorically. The space that had once parted for him out of fear now contained him through accountability. His reign of intimidation, built on the silence of victims and the indifference of bystanders, confronted something it couldn't overcome: evidence. In that fluorescent-lit hallway, surrounded by the peers he had dominated for so long, Marcus Jenkins faced the unfamiliar sensation of being powerless, not because someone stronger had come along, but because someone smarter, more strategic, and more courageous had refused to play by his rules altogether. The 10 seconds that followed Jasmine's unexpected response changed everything, not through physical confrontation, but through the strategic deployment of truth. As Marcus's confidence visibly crumbled, as his friends distanced themselves, as the gathered crowd grew bolder in their witnessing, the school's entire social ecosystem underwent a seismic shift. Power, which had seemed so solid and unchangeable, revealed itself to be conditional, dependent on collective acceptance of fear. And when that fear was challenged by one person who refused to accept its legitimacy, who had prepared to counter it with evidence rather than emotion, the entire structure began to collapse like a house of cards. This wasn't just a personal victory for Jasmine or a personal defeat for Marcus. It was a fundamental recalibration of what was possible, a template for resistance that relied not on matching force with force, but on transforming the rules of engagement entirely. In those 10 seconds, as Marcus struggled to process how completely the situation had slipped from his control, a new understanding rippled through the hallway. Bullying thrived in shadows, in isolation, in the absence of witnesses. By bringing light, community, and documentation to bear on the problem, Jasmine had discovered its fundamental weakness. The atmosphere in the hallway crackled with tension as Marcus stared at Jasmine's phone, the evidence of his actions playing back in high-definition clarity. The established order of Roosevelt High School teetered on the edge of transformation. What happened next would either cement this moment as a fleeting anomaly or mark it as the beginning of systemic change. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to intensify, casting everything in stark relief. There would be no shadows to hide in, no ambiguity to exploit. This moment would be witnessed, remembered, and documented in its entirety. "We started a group," a voice called out from the crowd, clear and steady despite its owner's history of speaking in whispers around Marcus. Heads turned to locate the source of these unexpected words. Andrea Chen stepped forward from the gathered students, her small frame moving with deliberate purpose. A sophomore whose first year at Roosevelt had been marked by weekly humiliations at Marcus's hands, Andrea had once been known for her tendency to disappear into the background, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Now she stood with her shoulders back, chin lifted, one hand raised to display her own phone, its camera actively recording. The transformation was so complete that several students did double takes, struggling to reconcile this confident figure with the girl who had once pressed herself against lockers to avoid attention. "We call ourselves Witness," Andrea continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, like a musician finding rhythm after a tentative opening note. The name itself carried meaning that rippled through the gathered crowd. To witness was not just to see but to testify, to confirm truth, to stand as living evidence of what had occurred. It implied both observation and responsibility. Passive viewing transformed into active documentation. Andrea's eyes, once habitually downcast in Marcus's presence, now met his directly. "We document everything. We support each other." For a moment, Marcus appeared genuinely confused, as if unable to process this new information within his established worldview. The idea that his victims had not only connected with each other, but had organized strategically was so far outside his understanding of school power dynamics that he seemed to struggle to comprehend what was happening. His expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, anger, and the first glimmers of genuine concern. His gaze darted around the hallway, searching for familiar faces of support, for the expressions of fear and submission that typically greeted his presence. Instead, he found a sea of eyes watching him with something new, a collective witnessing that left nowhere to hide. "And we're not afraid anymore," declared another voice, deeper and surprisingly steady. Tarek Patel stepped forward from another section of the hallway, his lanky frame unfolding from the crowd like a bird stretching long folded wings. A junior who had surrendered his lunch money to Marcus 3 times a week since freshman year. Derek had developed a reputation for having a permanent stoop to his shoulders, as if perpetually bracing for impact. Now he stood at his full height, nearly matching Marcus in stature, though with none of the bully's bulk. In his hand, he too held a phone, its lens focused unwavering on the scene unfolding before them. The device seemed less a piece of technology and more a talisman of protection, a symbol of newfound power. All around the hallway, the atmosphere shifted as 3 more students emerged from different positions in the crowd, each holding phones aloft, each standing with newfound purpose. Maya Rodriguez, whose artwork Marcus had deliberately destroyed during sophomore year, stepped away from the arts wing entrance. Jamal Washington, whose stutter intensified whenever Marcus approached, emerged from near the water fountain. Zoe Kim, who had transferred schools last year due to Marcus's torment, only to return this semester with quiet determination, moved forward from beside the trophy case. 5 students in total, positioned around the hallway like cardinal points on a compass, creating a circle of witnesses that surrounded Marcus and his increasingly uncomfortable friends. What made this moment particularly powerful wasn't just the presence of these 5 students, but the recognition spreading across Marcus's face as he identified each one. These weren't random challengers. They were specifically students he had targeted, individuals he had personally selected for intimidation, believing them to be the least likely to fight back. He had assessed them as weak, as vulnerable, as safe targets for his aggression. Now they stood forming a perimeter around him, their former vulnerability transformed into a different kind of power. Their phones captured his growing realization from multiple angles. The moment a bully comprehends that the carefully cultivated fear he relied upon had transformed into something else entirely. Marcus looked wildly around at his friends, seeking the backup he had always counted on, the followers who amplified his intimidation through their collective presence. But Tyler and Damon were already backing away, putting physical distance between themselves and what was unfolding. They had signed up for the easy dominance that came from following the school's most feared bully, not for the accountability now bearing down upon them from multiple directions. Their loyalty, it seemed, extended precisely to the point where consequences began. The abandonment was visible in real time. The tight trio that had moved through the halls like a predatory unit now dissolving as self-preservation instincts kicked in. "What's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone, instead taking on an almost childlike quality of confusion. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, seemed almost to be spoken to himself, a verbal manifestation of his internal disorientation. The power dynamics he had understood and exploited for years were shifting beneath his feet like tectonic plates, creating a new landscape he didn't know how to navigate. "Justice," replied Jasmine simply, the single word carrying the weight of months of careful planning. She didn't elaborate further, allowing the scene unfolding around them to speak for itself. There was no gloating in her tone, no vindictiveness, just the calm certainty of someone who had identified a problem and methodically worked toward its solution. The gathered crowd of students had grown larger now, drawn by the unprecedented nature of what was transpiring. Their collective presence added another layer to the moment. This wasn't happening in isolation but in full view of the school community. Dozens of additional phones were raised, capturing the scene from every conceivable angle. What might once have been dismissed as one person's word against another's was now being documented by an entire community, creating a tapestry of evidence that couldn't be denied or diminished. For students who had spent years navigating the hallways with strategic care to avoid Marcus's attention, there was something almost surreal about watching him now. Uncertain, abandoned by his friends, surrounded by evidence of his actions. The mythology of his invincibility crumbled in real time, revealing something much more human and far less intimidating underneath. The Emperor, it seemed, had no clothes, and everyone was not only seeing this truth, but recording it for posterity. "You targeted each of us because you thought we wouldn't fight back," Andrea said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of confronting her tormentor. "You thought we were easy targets because we were quiet, because we kept to ourselves. You never imagined we would talk to each other. You never thought we would compare notes," added Derek, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "You never considered that your victims might find each other, might realize the pattern, might decide to do something about it. And you definitely never thought we'd be smart enough to gather evidence," continued Maya, holding her phone a little higher. "That we'd document dates, times, witnesses, that we'd build a case no one could ignore." The strategic brilliance of what these students had accomplished began to dawn on the gathered crowd. They hadn't confronted Marcus individually, when they would have been vulnerable and easily dismissed. They hadn't responded with physical aggression, which would have merely perpetuated the cycle of violence and potentially cast them as instigators rather than victims. Instead, they had connected with each other, pooled their experiences, gathered evidence systematically, and chosen the perfect moment to reveal what they had built. They had transformed isolation, the very thing that made bullying so effective, into community, into collective action. Marcus's face shifted through a rapid progression of emotions as the full implications of his situation became clear. The initial shock gave way to anger, his default response to any challenge. But that anger quickly dissolved into something closer to fear as he processed how completely the situation had escaped his control. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely redesigned while he wasn't looking. His usual playbook of intimidation, which relied on victims feeling isolated and powerless, had no strategies for addressing organized resistance backed by documented evidence. The sound of adult footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder as Mr. Wallace, the vice principal, pushed his way through the gathered students. Behind him came Ms. Rodriguez, the hall monitor, whose face registered surprise at finding the corridor completely blocked by what appeared to be the entire student body. Both adults looked confused by the tableau before them. Marcus Jenkins, the school's notorious troublemaker, standing in the center of a circle formed by 5 students holding phones, with Jasmine Williams facing him directly. The usual hallway hierarchies had been completely upended, and even the staff members seemed momentarily unsure how to process what they were witnessing. "What's going on here?" Mr. Wallace demanded, his voice carrying the automatic authority of his position. He was a fair-minded administrator, but one who had developed a certain weariness after years of breaking up the same hallway conflicts between the same rotating cast of characters. His gaze focused first on Marcus, the student most frequently in his office, then shifted to Jasmine, whose academic record made her presence in this situation all the more surprising. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, his instinct to control the narrative still operational despite everything that had transpired. Here was his opportunity to reframe the situation, to cast himself as the victim of some elaborate setup, to leverage his long-standing relationship with the school's disciplinary system to his advantage. But before he could utter a single word, Jasmine spoke, her voice clear and purposeful. "We have something to show you, Mr. Wallace," she said, her tone respectful but resolute. "Something that's been going on for too long." The words themselves were simple, but they carried the weight of countless unreported incidents, of systemic patterns long ignored or minimized by the very institutions charged with ensuring student safety. Jasmine didn't phrase it as an accusation against the administration, yet there was an undeniable subtext. This group of students had been forced to create their own justice system because the official one had failed them repeatedly. Mr. Wallace's expression shifted as he registered the seriousness in Jasmine's voice, the phones held by multiple students, the uncharacteristic silence of Marcus Jenkins. Something significant was happening here, something that transcended the usual hallway disputes. "My office," he said after a moment, gesturing down the corridor. "All of you." His gaze swept across Jasmine, Marcus, and the 5 members of Witness, recognizing that whatever this situation entailed, it required proper attention rather than a quick hallway resolution. As the group began to move toward the administrative offices, the crowd of students parted to create a path. There was none of the usual jeering or excitement that typically accompanied students being escorted to the principal's office. Instead, there was a strange, respectful silence, as if the entire student body recognized they were witnessing a pivotal moment in their school's history. This wasn't just another disciplinary incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked behavior, the moment when silence and fear gave way to documentation and accountability. For the members of Witness, walking down that hallway marked a profound transformation. Students who had once hugged the walls or ducked into bathrooms to avoid Marcus's attention now walked with purpose, their phones still recording, their eyes forward. They moved not as victims, but as architects of change, as individuals who had reclaimed their agency in the most powerful way possible, not through retribution, but through truth-telling. The evidence they carried wasn't just about Marcus's actions. It was testimony to their own resilience, to their refusal to accept intimidation as an inevitable part of school life. Marcus walked at the center of this unusual procession, his usual swagger replaced by uncertain steps. For perhaps the first time since entering Roosevelt High, he moved through the hallways without the protection of feared reputation or intimidating presence. The whispers that followed him now were different. Not fearful murmurs, but the sound of a narrative being rewritten in real time, of power structures being questioned and found wanting. Whatever happened in the administrative offices, one thing was already clear. The old order had ended. The witnesses had spoken, and their testimony had changed everything. Principal Davis's office seemed smaller than usual that afternoon, its dimensions compressed by the gravity of what was unfolding within its walls. The space, designed to project authority with its dark wood desk and framed credentials, now served as the stage for a reckoning years in the making. A shaft of afternoon light cut through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the gathered faces and highlighting dust motes that danced in the air, oblivious to the human drama below. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish and the coffee that had gone cold in the principal's mug, abandoned as more pressing matters demanded her attention. Jasmine sat with perfect posture in one of the visitor chairs, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her backpack resting against her feet. Her composure stood in stark contrast to Marcus, who slumped in the adjacent seat, his typically imposing frame somehow diminished by the circumstances. He alternated between staring at the floor and shooting quick, furtive glances at Jasmine, as if trying to decode the strategy that had so completely upended his position in the school's hierarchy. The 5 members of Witness had been asked to wait outside after providing their phones and statements, but their presence lingered in the room like invisible witnesses to the proceedings. Principal Davis reviewed the videos on Jasmine's phone with meticulous care, her expression growing increasingly troubled with each swipe of her finger. The evidence unfurled before her eyes in high-definition clarity. Marcus cornering smaller students in isolated areas, demanding money with explicit threats, shoving those who hesitated, laughing as frightened freshmen emptied their pockets. Most damning of all was the systematic nature of it all. Not isolated incidents of teenage conflict, but a deliberate pattern of predation, carefully targeting those least likely to report or resist. The timestamps on the videos covered weeks, showing incidents in various locations throughout the school, involving dozens of victims. "This is deeply troubling, Marcus," Principal Davis finally said, setting the phone down on her desk with deliberate care. Her voice carried the weight of 2 decades in education, of countless disciplinary meetings and interventions, yet there was something different in her tone now. A gravity that acknowledged this wasn't routine teenage misbehavior. This isn't just bullying. This is extortion and assault. The words hung in the air, clinical and precise legal terms that stripped away the euphemisms often used to minimize such behavior in school settings. Not roughhousing or conflicts or disagreements, but criminal terminology that accurately named the actions documented in those videos. The principal's willingness to use such language signaled a shift in how the situation would be handled, not as an internal school matter to be resolved with detentions or stern talks, but as serious misconduct with potential legal ramifications. Marcus continued to stare at the floor, his usual bravado entirely absent. The carefully constructed persona of invincibility had crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. His hands, which had so often been used to intimidate, now fidgeted in his lap, fingers intertwining and separating in nervous repetition. Several times he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words emerged. What defense could be offered against his own actions, captured from multiple angles, documented with dates and times, presented with methodical thoroughness? "I'm calling your parents," Principal Davis continued, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, "and we'll be discussing suspension at minimum. The school has a zero-tolerance policy for physical intimidation." She reached for her desk phone, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if to underscore the inevitability of what was happening. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision, but the proper application of clearly established consequences. "While I make this call, I want you to wait in the outer office with Miss Thompson." Marcus rose from his chair without argument, his movements lacking their usual swagger. As he walked toward the door, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying a sudden weight, the physical manifestation of accountability settling upon him for perhaps the first time. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow seemed to mark the end of an era, the official conclusion of the impunity he had enjoyed for so long. With Marcus gone, the atmosphere in the office subtly shifted. Principal Davis turned her full attention to Jasmine, her expression softening slightly though remaining serious. "This was brave," she acknowledged, gesturing to the phone still sitting on her desk, "but also dangerous. Why didn't you come to us sooner?" The question contained layers of meaning beyond its surface inquiry. It was, in some ways, an admission that the school's systems for protecting students might have failed, a tacit acknowledgement that these students had felt the need to create their own justice mechanism in the absence of effective official channels. It was also a genuine expression of concern from an administrator who, despite the bureaucratic demands of her position, cared deeply about student safety. Jasmine straightened in her chair, meeting the principal's gaze directly. There was no defiance in her posture, but there was unwavering conviction, the calm certainty of someone who had carefully considered her actions and their potential consequences. "With all due respect, Ms. Davis, we did," she said, her voice steady and clear. 3 different students reported him last semester. Nothing changed. The simple statement landed with the weight of an indictment, not aggressively delivered but impossible to dismiss. It highlighted the gap between institutional policies and their practical implementation, between zero tolerance on paper and the complex reality of school hierarchies where certain students seem to operate with informal immunity. Jasmine wasn't merely criticizing. She was identifying a systemic failure that had necessitated extraordinary measures from those the system had failed to protect. "So we decided to gather evidence that couldn't be ignored," she continued, explaining rather than accusing. The we acknowledged her role not as a lone vigilant, but as part of a collective response to a persistent problem. The approach they had taken, documentation rather than confrontation, evidence rather than allegations, represented a sophisticated understanding of how systems work, of what kind of proof would be required to overcome the inertia of established patterns. Principal Davis had the grace to look ashamed, a flash of discomfort crossing her features before she composed herself. Educational administrators rarely receive such direct feedback about the failings of their systems, particularly from students who have found ways to work around those failings rather than simply complaining about them. "You're right," she admitted, the acknowledgement coming without defensiveness or qualification. "We failed you." Those 3 words, "we failed you," marked a profound shift in the dynamic between institution and student. It was an admission rarely heard in school settings, where authority often becomes its own justification and systems resist acknowledging their shortcomings. In accepting responsibility rather than deflecting it, Principal Davis created space for something new to emerge from this confrontation, not just accountability for Marcus but potential systemic change. "But what you've done today," she continued, gesturing toward the phone with its damning evidence, organizing other students, documenting everything. "That's remarkable leadership." There was genuine admiration in her voice now, recognition that these students had demonstrated skills that most educational institutions claim to value, but rarely provide meaningful opportunities to develop: critical thinking, problem solving, organization, advocacy, ethical application of technology. Jasmine absorbed the compliment without visible reaction, neither dismissing the praise nor appearing overly gratified by it. Her focus remained on the larger issues at hand rather than personal validation. "It shouldn't have been necessary," she said simply, not as accusation, but as observation. The statement acknowledged both the reality of what had happened and the possibility of a better system, where students wouldn't need to create elaborate documentation projects to protect themselves from harassment. Principal Davis nodded slowly, accepting both the compliment and the critique embedded in Jasmine's response. "No, it shouldn't have," she agreed, "and I need to ensure it won't be necessary in the future." The statement wasn't just personal but institutional, an acknowledgement that individual accountability for Marcus would be insufficient without addressing the systemic failures that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for so long. "The witness group has some ideas about that," Jasmine offered, reaching into her backpack and extracting a neatly organized folder. Inside were not just additional documentation of incidents, but something more constructive: a detailed proposal for enhancing the school's reporting systems, creating anonymous channels for students to share concerns, establishing clear tracking mechanisms for repeated incidents, and implementing regular training for staff on recognizing and addressing bullying behaviors. The document represented hours of collaborative work, of students applying their first-hand experiences of the system's failings to design potential solutions. Principal Davis accepted the folder with visible surprise, clearly not having expected such a comprehensive response from students. She opened it and scanned the first few pages, her eyebrows rising slightly as she recognized the thoroughness of what she was reviewing. These weren't vague complaints or unrealistic demands, but thoughtful, detailed recommendations grounded in the practical realities of school operations. "You've put a lot of thought into this," she observed, a new note of respect entering her voice. "We've had a lot of time to think about it," Jasmine replied, the simple statement carrying the weight of countless altered routes through hallways to avoid certain people, of lunches eaten in bathroom stalls rather than cafeterias, of constant vigilance that should never be part of any student's educational experience. The collective we've again emphasized that this wasn't just her personal crusade, but a response to experiences shared by many within the school's walls. As Principal Davis continued reviewing the document, the afternoon light shifted in the room, the shadows lengthening across the desk. Outside the office, the school day was winding toward its conclusion, bells ringing to signal class changes, lockers slamming as students retreat backpacks and jackets. But within this space, something significant was transpiring. Not just the processing of a disciplinary incident, but the potential beginning of meaningful institutional change. "I would like to meet with your whole group," Principal Davis said finally, closing the folder with care. "Not just about what happened today, but about these recommendations." The request represented a shift from students as passive recipients of policies to active participants in their creation, from problems to be managed to resources to be consulted. "We have a professional development day next week. Would you be willing to present some of these ideas to the faculty?" The invitation acknowledged the expertise these students had developed through their experiences, expertise that even well-intentioned administrators might lack. It was recognition that effective solutions would require input from those most affected by the problems, that student voices needed to be centered in discussions of school climate and safety. It represented the beginning of a collaboration rather than the conclusion of a disciplinary matter. Jasmine considered the request for a moment before nodding her agreement. "We'll be ready," she said, the simple affirmation carrying both commitment and expectation. They would contribute their insights, but they also anticipated those insights would be taken seriously, would lead to concrete actions rather than symbolic gestures. The aftermath of this confrontation wouldn't just be Marcus's punishment, but potentially a reimagining of how safety and accountability functioned within the school's ecosystem. As Jasmine gathered her belongings to leave, Principal Davis returned her phone, the evidence now backed up and secured for the disciplinary proceedings that would follow. "What you did today might change things for a lot of students," the principal said, her tone conveying both appreciation and a sense of possibilities opening. "Not just with Marcus, but with how we approach these issues going forward." Jasmine paused at the door, considering this assessment. "That was always the goal," she replied, revealing that her actions had never been primarily about bringing down one particular bully, but about creating space for systemic change. In that simple statement was revealed the true sophistication of what she and her fellow students had accomplished. They had understood that lasting change required not just individual accountability, but institutional transformation. As she stepped out of the office, Jasmine found the other members of Witness waiting, their faces a mixture of anxiety and hope. The aftermath of their collective action was just beginning to unfold, with consequences both intended and unforeseen still to emerge. What they had set in motion, not just Marcus's reckoning, but potentially the school's, would continue to develop in the days and weeks ahead. But in this moment, standing together outside the principal's office, they had already accomplished something significant. They had transformed from isolated victims into connected advocates, from targets into agents of change. The afternoon light slanted through the administrative office windows, casting long shadows as another school day drew to a close. But unlike countless afternoons before it, this one ended with a subtle but profound shift in the school's equilibrium, a shift toward accountability, toward safety, toward a community where witnessing became not just passive observation, but active engagement with creating something better. The aftermath was just beginning, its full dimensions not yet visible, but already it contained the seeds of transformation that would continue to grow long after this specific incident faded from immediate memory. The next month brought significant changes to Roosevelt High. Marcus received a 2-week suspension and mandatory counseling. When he returned, he was quieter, more subdued. The hallways felt different. Students walked more freely, talked more openly. Jasmine and her group formalized Witness as an official school club with Mr. Wallace as their faculty advisor. They created a system where students could safely report bullying incidents and receive support. One afternoon, as Jasmine was leaving debate practice, she found Marcus waiting outside the classroom. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side in silence for a moment. "My counselor says I need to make amends," Marcus finally said. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you could have just tried to hurt me back. You could have just gotten me expelled. But instead, you actually fixed something." Jasmine studied him thoughtfully. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Marcus, even bullies." "I don't expect forgiveness," Marcus said. "But the counselor is helping me understand some things about myself. Why I acted that way." He paused. "My dad, he's not a good man. I thought being feared meant being respected." Jasmine nodded slowly. "Fear and respect aren't the same thing. You saw that in 10 seconds, didn't you?" Marcus managed a small smile. "Yeah, 10 seconds that changed everything." 1 year later, at graduation, Jasmine stood at the podium as class valedictorian. Looking out at her classmates, she spotted Marcus sitting with his family. He had joined the peer counseling program 6 months ago, working with middle school students on conflict resolution. "When I was a little girl," Jasmine began, "my grandmother told me something I'll never forget. She said, sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to your enemies, but standing up for them too. I didn't understand what that meant until last year." She paused, looking around the auditorium. "We came to Roosevelt as strangers, many of us afraid. Afraid of not fitting in, afraid of being targeted, afraid of not measuring up. But fear only has the power we give it. True strength isn't about who can intimidate others. It's about who can inspire them to be better." In the audience, Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the journey they had both taken. Today, Roosevelt isn't just a safer school, it's a kinder one. And that didn't happen because we defeated the bullies. It happened because we refused to create more of them. As she concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Jasmine knew that the real victory wasn't what had happened in those 10 seconds in the hallway. The real victory was what happened in all the moments that followed, when students realized that standing together was more powerful than standing over anyone.